already off the bat, using sex and beef semen, we're about $51 in net return per cow per year ahead.
That's real cash. Welcome back, everyone, to the Dairy Science Digest. This is a podcast designed to bring the Journal of Dairy Science straight to the ears of dairy producers. I'm Reagan Bluhl from the University of Missouri Dairy Team, and today's guest is Megan Lauber, a grad student at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She and her team, Paul Fricke and Victor Cabrera, have identified an opportunity to better understand the impact of several parameters on the future of your herd. But to be more specific, actually the title of this featured paper today really does do a nice job summarizing what the goal is and what our conversation will be based around. And the title is An Economic Simulation Model to Assess the Effects of 21-Day Preg Rate, Semen Type, and Heifer Survival Rate on the Optimum Insemination Eligibility Period for lactating dairy cows. So, everyone listening to that list recognizes that all of those items do have a dramatic impact on your herd, but no one's really truly taken the time to quantify the relationship of each one until now. So, Miss Megan, let's dive right in. And first of all, thank you for joining us on this chilly day. Here's a warm welcome to the Dairy Science Digest. Would you please take a moment to introduce yourself to the audience?
Well, thank you, Reagan, for the invitation, and thank you all for tuning in. As Reagan said, my name is Megan Lauber. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in the Department of Animal and Dairy Sciences. My roots start off in dairy. I grew up on a small dairy farm in southeastern Wisconsin. That's really where I got my interest and passion for dairy. From there, I went on to UW-Madison, completed my bachelor's as well as my master's in dairy science, and just really fell in love with research and asking these biological questions, but also diving in and doing a little bit something different here, trying to model some of these effects that, are a little bit challenging to actually do with commercial dairy farms with the time allotted and the resources. So really looking forward to diving in more with you all about the research that we conducted.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And your paper's done a wonderful job looking at how all the details matter, and quantifying that. I admitted offline, guys, before we hit record, I feel like I need to just disclose and expose myself. I admitted that these modelings kind of are complex for this ruminant nutritionist, and so there are a lot of parts and pieces to this paper. But I think before we get into all of that, I know that every listener out here is keenly aware of those transformative impacts that strategic breeding has had really over the last 5 years. And this paper specifically focuses on beef and xx-semen, and I know you guys have all heard that story before. But guys, don't zone out. Stay with me for just a minute, because this paper has updated 2025 numbers documenting the true tsunami effect that dairy has had on the beef semen industry. And we all know it's a lot, but listen here more closely. Megan, could you please delve into some of those numbers that you shared in the paper's introduction about the use of xx-semen and beef semen in the dairy industry?
Yes, like you've said, Reagan, things have just really exploded with the use of beef semen on dairy. And I think it's important that we take a step back to recognize that we're able to do these things of using sex and beef semen to regulate herd inventory because we've had progress in reproductive performance in our lactating dairy cows. We wouldn't be here if we had the previous preg rates that we had. Now
Right.
I joke with people that 30 is the new 20, and so being able to have that performance to adopt these technologies is really critical. I mean, if we look at the numbers from the National Association of Animal Breeders, domestic beef semen sales, I mean, dairy herds were accounting for about 81% of the total beef semen sales. So just
Wow.
really a testament to see, and we've had some previous literature published with dairy records management systems, looking at these trends and some of the papers I referenced of mine over the years. And, we're really seeing this adaptation increase with sex and beef semen, and it's something we're interested in exploring with more recent numbers, how that trend continues. I mean, like you'd expect, most herds, right, are using sex semen on those younger, more on average genetically elite females at more fertile services first and second, whereas we're using more beef semen on older, on average less genetically elite females at later services.
Yeah, and so I think part of this topic today, guys, I don't want to mislead you. at the end of this discussion, there's not going to be a silver bullet that Miss Megan's going to tell us today that says this is how your farm should proceed. Every farm is going to be uniquely different. And I think the value of this paper here is to help us quantify that and help us use our herd data to better understand how to navigate the market opportunities and the best way to advance your herd forward. So there's several metrics that we're going to go over today that go into the insemination eligibility period. But let's start first with Preg Rate. That's a real common metric for the dairy industry, but can be highly variable among herds. To truly wrap your head around the impact of Preg Rate on the trajectory, we've got low quantified at 20%, below average, average, above average, and high at 40. So in between each one of those categories is a 5% change. So 20, 25, 30, 30 being the average, above average 35, and high being 40% preg rate. And you kind of tickled in on that a little bit in the intro. 40 is a number that was not really obtained 10 years ago. Talk a little bit about the advancements of preg rate and how you've seen that transform the industry.
Oh, absolutely. It's something actually Paul and I joke with students now, they don't understand how bad repro used to be. So 30 for them, it's just
Normal.
standard. And we
Yeah.
joke that yes, that
No.
30 is the new 20, but it is something we have to appreciate, over the times of how management has improved, not only with the peri-parchment period, having cows in the high fertility cycle,
Mm-hmm.
increase of genetic advancements, better management with mastitis, everything else, but also really recognizing the importance of fertility programs, going from the OVSync protocol that just increased service rate to now
Mm-hmm.
fertility programs such as double OVSync or pre-sync OVSync, where we have cows go completely through with time to eye, just truly how much that increases the actual fertility of the cow and not just
Yes.
increasing service rate. So those technologies have been really instrumental in increasing 21-day pregnancy rate. And, I like what you mentioned before, Reagan, where I'm not here to be prescriptive by any means.
Mm-mm.
Each herd is very different. The intention of this model is that we'll have this become live where herds can implement their own herd specific parameters.
Very
And so
cool.
what the intention of this model was to use what we thought were representative herd scenarios. So having herds with, as you mentioned, low reproductive performance, a 20% 21-day pregnancy risk, all the way up to herds that are having this high reproductive performance of a 40% 21-day pregnancy risk, which we are seeing in some of our elite top producing herds today, which
Yes.
is, like you said, something we never thought we'd see.
Pretty special. Also, in that metric of the equation, you also calculated in different scenarios around semen. So, talk through what is in the model as far as how these scenarios are built.
Yeah, so with these scenarios, what we wanted to do is make some pretty drastic comparisons of previously the old way, right, where we didn't have these technologies or combinations of sex and beef semen to regulate herd inventory. So with these scenarios, we had one, which was just conventional semen, and this was used across all parities, all services. Basically, what we were doing before to now where we have this other scenario in addition to these pregnancy risk with using sex and beef semen. So how we chose to model this was based on some data that we had from DRMS and what we thought was representative of what a lot of herds are doing, using sex semen on first and second lactation cows for first and second service, with all the remaining inseminations being beef semen. So this was truly just a sex and beef semen model in that point.
And kind of alluded to at the introduction, these so far, guys, everything that you've heard is probably pretty similar, pretty familiar. But really, the nuance here is combining all of this with heifer survival rate and then also this beef calf value. Because we all know that the beef calf value and this cross calf is really transforming our, what we recognize is that these black calves have really changed the net return of our baby calves. And so understanding that and how that impacts the trajectory of our herd and making sure that we have enough females in the hopper to be successful 2 years from now is really important. And so, a term that we've kind of thrown around here a little bit is the insemination eligibility period. Can you talk about that a little bit more and better define what is this term, insemination eligibility period?
Absolutely. And so with this manuscript, I first want to say, because of these increases in reproductive performance, we wanted to see, we know with a lot of things, right? There's this what we call the law of diminishing returns, that we can only get so much value depending on where we are in that curve. And for a long time, based on previous models with conventional semen, it's been thought that we're kind of at that plateau. There's not as much to gain
Mm-hmm.
by going beyond a 30% 21-day pregnancy risk.
Hmm.
But, as we mentioned, with increased reproductive performance, the use of sexed and beef semen, the value of these calves, like you mentioned, we
Mm-hmm.
wanted to take a step further to really see, does that value exist beyond that? Is that law of diminishing returns truly where we initially thought it was with conventional semen, or is there still more opportunity to gain? And so one way we wanted to look at this was this optimal insemination eligibility period, which is similar to what we're calling like a breeding window after the voluntary
Mm-hmm.
weaning period, or how many inseminations is it valuable to keep this cow, particularly with beef semen and the value that we see of it, before having that cow identified as a do not breed
Yeah.
and removing her for the herd for reproductive failure. And so that was what we're kind of getting into with this optimal insemination period, or this breeding window.
Yes, and isn't that a question that we've just heard producers say over and over and over again? So, can I just take a moment to applaud you and your team for hearing the question and finding the science to help us use this data set to understand how to manage our herd
Mhm.
differently? Because the last thing we want to do is use all of this beef semen in our herd and then get 2 years down the road and not have enough replacement. And I think industry wide we've maybe kind of started to see that a little bit as there's a as you've got replacement animals selling all day any day for anywhere from $3,500 to $4,000 for an open fresh animal. Those numbers are just unheard of, and it's reflective of the marketplace. So yes.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yes. And that's one thing. That's why we want to also include this, right? That it can be very costly also to not have replacements and the replacements that you want, as you mentioned, Reagan. And we're seeing that now, earlier on, early 2020s, a little bit before that, you couldn't sell replacements for the cost of rearing them. But now
Right.
people have gotten very excited. And I think we maybe had some miscalculations in the understanding of truly how many replacement heifers we're having
Needed.
retained and making it to first
Hmm.
lactation. And now, as you mentioned, yeah, we're in this interesting dynamic with increased values for these dairy beef crossbred calves, increased market values for market cows as a salvage value, and also these increased market values for these replacement heifers. So always important to consider these dynamics, and with this tool, try to use it where this can be adapted based on current market conditions.
But what an exciting time it is to be a dairy farmer, right? To have the
Oh yes,
opportunity
it
to,
never gets boring.
yeah, right. You've got the value of your milk, but at this point you have all these other enterprises available to you to help your
Mhm.
your net profit for your entire operation.
Absolutely. And part of the reason too we wanted to look at this, Reagan, like you mentioned, these values for replacements, these dairy beef crossfits. And when we looked at this optimal insemination period, or this breeding window, with conventional semen, this has traditionally been found that typically the optimal period to stop inseminating a cow is earlier in her lactation,
Mm-hmm.
approximately like 150 days in milk. We're maximizing our income from milk over feed costs
Mm-hmm.
at that point, and that's really what's leveraging that income by having that shorter breeding
Window.
window, and increasing that. But it's interesting, it was sex semen with these beef calves, as I'll kind of get into here. It's not quite the same case, which is just
Yeah.
very interesting.
Yes. Okay, so let's just delve right into this data. I do want to remind you guys that they looked at primiparous animals, but also they broke out multiparous into second lactation, and then you break it into your more mature multiparous animals. And I guess kind of let's pause right there for just a minute. So as you start to see this IEP change or increase, how do you expect that to transform or maybe manipulate the parity of our national herd?
With keeping cows likely longer, you see in this model of having a longer insemination eligibility period, we might have a little bit of an older herd, right? So that's something to consider. We can cover things in our model, but as I like to say from the famous professor, Dr. George Fox, he's a statistician here at UW, all models are wrong, but some are useful. And so those are things that we do have to consider with potentially having an older herd, how that affects reproductive performance, health incidences. We do have some of that model, but you can only cover so much in a model as well. So having a longer period, you typically have a slightly older herd, but also reproductive performance plays a big part in that, right? If we have herds that have increased reproductive performance, also, you
Mm-hmm.
could have potentially an older herd in this certain modeling scenario, because I should point out that this model assumes that we're maintaining herd size.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is assuming that all calves that are born are sold and we
Mm.
buy back only the necessary replacements to maintain herd size.
Ah, good
And
detail.
so that's one thing, right? We need to think about with current market conditions, right? We think, with herds with high 21-day pregnancy risk, we could make a lot of heifers that might increase our herd turnover rate and actually decrease the age of our herd.
Mm-hmm.
But in this instance, because of how the assumptions that we had, the herd in this instance would be older.
Ages.
So some of those key dynamics to think through.
Yeah, wonderful. And I think kind of getting into the weeds on each one of these topics, this podcast could last for 2 hours. And so I apologize
I,
for dragging that into. But guys, I think it brings attention to the fact, or shines a light on the fact, that all these details matter, and you have to best understand what is best for your herd through data analysis is really what it boils down to. Now, we're going to dive right into the actual assessment and the models that are presented. And like always, I've got a clickable link there at the bottom of the show notes. And I really encourage you this time to pull this up, guys. There are so many color-coded graphs in this particular document that it probably is worth pulling out and printing, but print it on a color copier, because this is really insightful to see the change over all these different models, over the different preg rates. Let's just start there in figure 3. We move forward to the brass tacks and the dollars that are impacted in this model. Can you talk a little bit about income over feed cost and some of these other financial metrics that you included in the model?
Oh, absolutely. So on this model, we try to be very encompassing. We have our replacement costs, our reproductive management costs, which these values are consistent over our scenarios, except we do have a little discount for our reproductive management costs if performance was lower or higher based on our average of a 30% 21-day pregnancy risk, as well as we have our income from calves, which in this we had market values of the time. I think the most important one to highlight is our beef on dairy crossbred calves of $570. And so I
Yes,
always want to tell
okay.
people that with a grain of salt, because if we look, at least here in Wisconsin, these values now are closer to
Double.
$1,300 on
Right,
average.
right.
So potentially these values could be even greater. But what I think is interesting when we go into this and look at typically income over feed costs is driving our net return here
Mm-hmm.
when we're looking at these things. It's interesting that should be consistent like we expect, whether we're using xx-semen or conventional semen, because those parameters were the same across the scenarios. What's really interesting is the shape of the net return. We
Yes.
typically see the peak of net return with conventional semen at 80 days, which follows, like I mentioned earlier, that about 150-day optimal period
But then it just
to maximize
plateaus.
net return.
That
Yes, but then it's interesting with the sex and beef semen,
yeah.
actually, it decreases at that point. But really, the plateau starts at about 110, 140 days, with actually the peak at 200 days of milk, or 200 days insemination period, excuse me, which is very, very interesting, which is suggesting that, despite this increase in income we're having from milk sales, from having
Yes.
more cows in the optimal stage of the lactation curve,
Yes.
it's not compensating for the increased value we're receiving of increasing the sales from those beef on dairy crossbred calves, which is super interesting.
Yes, wow. It just, and okay, and so here the ruminant nutritionist is kind of starting to geek out over here, because if you've got a 220-day, okay, no, it would be 290-day animal, it's suggesting, am I reading this saying that she's still gathering up a profitable net return getting bred that late?
So this would suggest that yes, breeding an animal, let's say at 270 days, still generating a pregnancy would be profitable with these sex and beef scenarios.
Wow.
However, as you said, as a nutritionist, it brings up some concerns.
Yeah.
And I will also joke that you said you're not a reproductive biologist. I'm not a nutritionist. I don't play one on TV.
Yeah.
But again, where we have to talk about some of the limitations that we have with models and things to consider, right? This is also an important consideration. We're not able to include effects of body condition score change
Yes.
for the subsequent lactation. And, incidences of periparturient health issues on how that might affect reproductive performance, lactation performance. So that is one thing I always like to mention with this, that there is opportunity to gain, but we also have to caution with some of those other known associations that we have
Hmm.
with performance when considering, these intervals of what works best for our herd. Because like you said, as having overconditioned cows and potentially having
Yeah.
them that late in lactation also can bring other concerns.
Sure. Yeah, the physiological impact of all of these things doesn't change just based on these wild, crazy market conditions. And if there's anybody out there that's listening to this as an archived fashion, this is November of 2025, and I want to document that because I think this is a moving target, guys. And that's why I'm so excited to highlight your study here, because this model, long term, I think the goal is to have it in a tool that producers can use to then work through and determine what's best for their herd. Now, that tool is probably not available quite yet, right? Or is it?
We're working on that,
Yeah.
not quite yet, but that's exactly the intention, Reagan, right? Again, all models are wrong, but some are useful. And so I don't ever want to be prescriptive with this type of data
Mm-hmm.
because everybody's situation is very different as a dairy herd and their goals and their current parameters. And so that is the intention, to work with Dr. Cabrera, Victor, to make this tool available on his website, where he already has a plethora of tools
Yes.
relating to production, grouping, heifer replacement, genetics, feeding management on dairies, to help further provide open access tools for producers to better understand their herds and improve their profitability.
To make their own prescription. Because let's be real, it's going to be
There you go.
different for
Yes,
everybody.
absolutely.
And so I think the important thing here is to recognize that there's people out here to help you assess your data and to make sure everything that you're reading aligns with this most ideal marketplace, but also biological pressure. So, flipping the page here, we've got figure number 4. You want to talk a little bit about herd turnover rate and heifer survival and how that might move and change the mark.
Oh, absolutely. With the market value replacement heifers that we're seeing, and the fact that we need replacement heifers, right, to maintain herd size, as much as it's enticing to make many of these valuable beef on dairy crossbred calves, we wanted to account for this. So in these diagrams, the colored bar that we have reflects the herd turnover rate and the proportion of replacements that we have. For instance, if it's red, we don't have enough replacements to maintain herd size.
Mm-hmm.
That's not a feasible option for our dairy. The yellow is a scenario where we make enough replacement heifers, but it might not be the most profitable based on this model. And the green is the scenario where we have enough replacements to maintain herd size. And the green is where we actually maximize our net profit. And so it's interesting in these scenarios with conventional semen, typically, again, having a shorter insemination period of typically around 80 days, if that's possible. With lower reproductive performance, we typically have to push that back a couple because we don't make enough replacements
Mm-hmm.
initially to maintain herd size, with a 20 or a 25% 21-day pregnancy risk with conventional semen. But interesting with the sexed beef, that regardless of the 21-day pregnancy risk, we make enough replacements, and the maximum still is at a 200-day insemination eligibility period.
Let's just pause for just 2 seconds on that one. Can we talk about heifer hoarding and what that means in the dairy industry? Am I reading these bars correctly to indicate that it's just in our core to want to see what those replacement heifers are going to do in the future, and but there's a cost to that, right? Do you want to talk a little bit about why is that green bar so far out?
And so this is something, again, we have to take in consideration, that this model is assuming that we're maintaining herd size and
Ah,
purchasing replacements at the cost of rearing. There are absolutely opportunities, right, and potential as an insurance policy to have slightly more heifers than we potentially need,
mm-hmm.
that, we ensure that we have enough in case our herd turnover rate shifts, being able to make genetic culling decisions as well. Because as much as we want to select for the top proportion with sex semen to make our next generation of elite females, even of those heifers that we do produce, that genetics is going to follow a bell-shaped curve, and there's
Sure.
always selection to be done. And so again, we'll state that a limitation of this model is that we don't account for genetic selection and genetic improvement of that. And so that might serve as an advantageous step for some herds, right, if you're implementing genomic testing. And also, it's just something we want to have as an insurance policy, right, to create enough replacements. But on the flip side, too, if we're not doing anything with that data and we have a
Mm.
lot of replacement heifers that we're not making decisions, That can be costly. Current market conditions kind of favor those who have more heifers right now. That is an advantage for them potentially to sell some of those lower end replacements as lactating cows. But again, it's just the dynamics of these markets and a lot of things that we have to consider when making these decisions.
Yeah, man, every single statement that we keep going back to is it depends. It depends.
I know that's the
Like
true
all of
scientific
it.
answer.
Yes.
And it
Uh
depends but it
ah
depends on what and why.
yes,
And so
right. Yes.
I think that's always really important to highlight that there is some logic to it, but again, it could also be costly, right? With
Mhm.
overstocking, trying to maximize growth and development of your heifers. Also, if you're training a lot, those are also unseen costs. There is importance to having insurance policy, but how much is enough
Sure.
also is a
Yeah.
very valid point.
Right. Well, and the thing is just have a sharp pencil, guys. Recognizing the cost of heifer rearing is it's a real cost, guys.
Oh, absolutely. It's
Yeah.
a mhm.
And I
Those days
know,
on feed really add up, and yes,
yes.
absolutely.
And everybody listening knows that statement, but ding dang it, until you sit down and actually sharpen the pencil and pull those schedule F's and know what your cost of production is for days on feed for that replacement group, um, wow, it doesn't do justice. I mean, you can know it, but until you see it on paper, it kind of amplifies it in my mind. So let's talk a little more about net returns and specifically this model. Guys, the brass tacks on figure 5 is where it gets really exciting to look at the value of the net return for these different parameters. So please talk through how to read this graph and what some of the results of the model concluded.
So with this, we wanted to do a few what I call sensitivity analysis, like basically varying some of these costs to
Mm-hmm.
seeing how that impacts our net return on a per cow per year basis. So this graph, we have that value of net return per cow per year on the y-axis. On the x is that insemination eligibility period again from 50 to 260 days, 120 to 330 days in milk. And each line, the different colors, are varying costs of that dairy beef crossbred calf, going all the way down to $385, which was the base value actually of our heifer and bull calf dairy calf price,
Yes.
all the way up to 570, going to 570, which was the average value at the time we created this model for dairy beef crossbred calves, going up in increments to all the way up to $1,125 per calf. And
And who would have thought that it would be, beyond
right when
that
I
green
made
line, right?
Yes, I was gonna say, I was just curious to see. I mean, like you'd expect when you increase those values, you dramatically increase your net return. But I think the funniest part when I was doing these sensitivity analysis, I think most people, even including myself, was like $1,100 a little over for a dairy beef crossbred calf.
No
That seems kind of
way.
a little outlandish, but like now, yes, exactly with
Uh,
current values, and I'm like, wow, like this is
but
actually kind of behind with what's being seen out here in the marketplace.
But good to do these sensitivities because the reality is that while we're looking at future markets being strong for at least
Hmm.
another year or maybe more,
Hmm.
it's probably not going to be forever, guys. And so understanding how this model changes relative to the beef calf market is important. So, where did you see the best IEP return in this scenario?
Well, as you would expect, with this, the further you increase those values, the further you push out that optimal period. So, with that $385 value, it's going to follow similar to your conventional semen model, right? Typically peaking a little bit earlier. But yeah, as we continue to increase the value of that dairy beef crossbred calf, that maximums are occurring even later at 230, 260 days. Again, we have to consider some of these physiologic aspects of truly is that worth
Uh huh.
making that choice to do that.
Right.
Likely not, again, not included in this model, but important for producers to consider, is it more advantageous to give that cow one or two more chances of becoming pregnant or three, increasing those opportunities, but still considering some of these physiologic aspects that are relevant but not incorporated into this model.
Wow, this is going to be such a cool tool, guys, to be able to tweak all of these details to make it unique specific to your herd. Now, if I could fast forward over to figure 7,
Mhm.
this is the effects of increasing the herd 21-day preg rate from 20 being the quote unquote low to 40 high preg rate available, and how that impacts the difference in annual net return. So talk me through this graph a little bit when we're using conventional versus sexed and beef semen.
Absolutely. And this gets back to what I mentioned earlier in our discussions here that, for a long time with previous models that it really plateaued. We had that law of diminishing returns that, maybe going beyond that 30% 21-day pregnancy rate, there really wasn't much to gain, which we expect, we're always going to have that law of diminishing returns.
Mm-hmm.
The classic one is money and happiness, where you can only increase money so much and you only increase happiness so much. I don't know about farmers and other people. I haven't quite gotten there yet, but
Yeah.
I'll believe people who've told me that. But following the same effect where we're curious, we took this even a step further of
Mm-hmm.
varying this 21-day pregnancy rate here you see on the x-axis of this graph by 1 percentage point increments to look at, when we consider within a breeding window.
Yeah.
This was all done with a 170-day breeding window because regardless of the semen type and the scenario, we knew we could make enough replacement heifers. So
Yes.
wanted to make it a fair comparison. We wanted to see, is that law of diminishing return with the sex and beef and some of these other considerations plateauing or leveling off as early as previous models suggested when we're using sex and beef semen. And so we have this difference in net return on our y-axis. And so on just looking at the base of this 20% 21-day pregnancy rate,
Mm-hmm.
already off the bat, using sex and beef semen, we're about $51 in net return per cow per year ahead
That's
by
real
using that type of
cash.
model with
Yeah.
these. That's real cash.
Yeah.
And then depending on how much you gain and where you are on this curve, if you're gaining increased reproductive performance starting at a lower 21-day pregnancy rate, you have more to gain versus those that are later. But we're across this curve with sexed and beef semen, you have about $2 to $7 to gain
Mm-hmm.
per 1 percentage point increase in the 21-day pregnancy rate, and about $3 to $6 to increase in net return per cow per year per that 1 percentage point increase in the 21-day pregnancy risk.
So I
So
guess,
that's real dollars.
yeah, it really is. So I is it so bold of me to say out of this entire model, can you say that is this the one metric that has the greatest impact on bottom line?
I would say that yes, 21-day pregnancy rate typically yes is our metric that always has one of the biggest influences, right? We know that reproductive performance is really critical on how it influences our income from milk sales, how we're having cows in what stage of lactation,
Mm-hmm.
sales from calves, as well as our replacement rate. So I think, yes, this is what I like to tell people the money graph that really emphasizes the value and importance of um, increased reproductive performance as a metric of the 21-day pregnancy rate.
And so it was just like me to kind of jump ahead and go towards the money graph and whatnot. But perhaps I did listeners a disservice. Let's rewind and talk a little bit about the 170-day IEP and why is that the window? How did you determine that that was the best insemination eligibility period to zoom in on?
So simply, this was chosen just as a basis because we knew, based on figure 4, that this was a scenario or a window, a breeding window or an insemination period where I knew across the models we can make enough replacement heifers
Yeah.
across those scenarios. That was simply the metric of it, and to make it a fair comparison, because we could also look, right, each scenario has their maximum net return and sufficient replacements at a different window, specifically with the conventional semen, but wanted to make it a fair comparison. So that's why we chose that, because that with conventional semen with a 20% 21-day pregnancy risk,
Mm.
that was the period that we had enough replacements and we maintained herd size. So we made it just as a blanket comparison
Got it. So
for everyone.
apples are apples to get that total net return. Very good. Okay, so my favorite question to ask all interviewees is, what from this very comprehensive modeling effort that you've completed would you really like boots on the ground dairymen to learn from this project?
So what I like dairymen to understand is that, with that changes that we've seen in the marketplace, the increased reproductive performance, these adoptions of different semen types, sexed and beef semen, that there are opportunities for your herd to increase your net return by increasing your 21-day pregnancy risk, as well as using sexed and beef semen. The classical, what we've typically seen of that law of diminishing returns, maybe isn't quite plateauing as early
Mm-hmm.
as we thought, and there are still opportunities for herds to gain or increase their net return by using sexed and beef semen, as well as increasing their herd 21-day pregnancy rate. But a lot of these, again, come with caveats that we have to ensure we have enough replacement heifers, in addition to considering, these great market values that we're seeing, considering heifer survival rate of how many heifers we actually have making it to first lactation,
Mm-hmm.
also including the genetic components, and that, when working with this to decide what's best for your herd, it's not taking a piece from this and saying, okay, that's exactly what's going to match my herd, but thinking on a more herd specific level and using something like this tool when it becomes available to make those decisions.
Absolutely. Not a one size fits all, but rather a strategy for every dairy farm manager to manage the future of their successes. Megan, this has been a great discussion, and I thank you so much for your time and willingness to share the robust analysis with our listening audience. I know that this will help folks wrap their heads around the impact of their management decisions on the bottom line of their operation. So, listeners, I applaud you for taking time out of your day to day to listen in to determine which one of these metrics you plan to improve on to uniquely advance your herd forward, recognizing that there's not this one size fits all approach. I've really enjoyed the scholarly discussion and learned a lot from our conversation. This has been the November edition of the Dairy Science Digest, a monthly podcast project designed to bring the Journal of Dairy Science straight to your ears. We highlight peer-reviewed research articles and press from the Journal of Dairy Science because it's sound science to base your management decisions around and provided to you by your University of Missouri Dairy team. So please be sure to share, like, and subscribe to get future editions straight to your cell phone. This is Reagan Bluell with the Dairy Science Digest, and I hope you have a great day.